Tonight, we ride beneath a wide and fading sky. This is the full story of Red Dead Redemption, a tale of fading outlaws, quiet sacrifice, and the slow march of a world that refuses to stand still. Settle in. Let the plains stretch wide around you. Let the wind move softly through the tall grass. If you enjoy drifting through the stories of classic games like this, consider liking the video, subscribing to the channel, and letting me know in the comments which game we should ride into next. Now, let's begin. The year is 1911. The Old West is no longer wild in the way it once was. Railroads carve through deserts. Telegraph wires hum faintly in the wind. Towns grow larger, more organized, more watchful. The age of open-range outlaws has thinned into rumor and memory. And a lone man steps off a train into the dusty town of Blackwater. John Marston moves carefully as his boots touch the platform. He is older now than the young outlaw who once rode beneath Dutch Vanderlin's banner. His face carries lines carved by years of consequence. His posture is steady but not careless. He wears no gang colors, no insignia, just a weathered coat, a revolver at his hip, and the quiet weight of unfinished history. The train pulls away behind him with a long, lonely whistle. John does not watch it go. Blackwater feels civilized compared to the frontier towns of years past. Brick buildings line the main street. Well-dressed men move briskly along wooden boardwalks. Government offices stand firm and polished near the center of town. And waiting near those offices are two men, Agent Edgar Ross, Agent Archer Fordham. Ross stands tall and patient, hat brim low, eyes sharp. He greets John not like an enemy, but like a man collecting something overdue. There is no warmth in the exchange. Ross reminds John why he is here. Bill Williamson, former member of the Vanderlinde gang, once a follower, now a problem. Bill has gathered a group of hardened outlaws in New Austin. He has attacked ranchers, threatened settlements, rebuilt something dangerous in the desert. Ross makes the terms simple. Bring Bill in, dead or alive. John says little. He knows this is not a request. Ross reminds him of Abigail, of Jack, of Beecher's hope. The leash is invisible, but it is tight. Soon after, John boards another train, this one heading south toward the harsher lands of New Austin. As the countryside rolls past the window, the world begins to change again. Trees thin, grass fades into red dust. The sky stretches wider. The land grows unforgiving. The train arrives in Armadillo under blazing sun. The town is smaller than Blackwater, rougher. Wind pushes dust through every street corner. Wooden buildings creak under heat. A few townsfolk move slowly, hats tipped low against the glare. John steps off the train and pauses. The desert wind brushes against his coat. Somewhere beyond this town, Fort Mercer rises from red earth, Bill Williamson's chosen fortress. John walks into the saloon first. The piano plays lazily in the corner. Men drink quietly. A card game moves slowly near the window. He asks about Bill. The name shifts the room's mood instantly. Fort Mercer lies south of town, they tell him. Stone walls, armed guards. A man who believes he has built himself a kingdom. John listens carefully. There is no anger in him, only inevitability. Later that afternoon, he rides out alone. The desert is vast and quiet beneath enormous sky. Heat ripples across the ground. Small shrubs cling stubbornly to life between cracked earth. The horizon feels endless. And then he sees it. Fort Mercer. Stone rising from sand. Guard towers outlined against blue sky. A place built not for comfort, but for defiance. John rides closer, not recklessly, but openly. He calls out. Bill appears along the wall, squinting down. For a moment, the years seem to fall away. Two former brothers in arms, separated now by time and consequence. Bill laughs. He calls John a traitor, a government dog, a man who traded loyalty for comfort. John doesn't deny it. He simply tells Bill to surrender. The desert wind moves between them. Bill raises his rifle. The shot cracks through the still air. John barely manages to turn his horse in time. Bullets tear into dust near his boots as he rides hard away from the fort. The sound echoes sharply across red rock. The meeting is over. The message is clear. This will not end with words. As the sun lowers behind the mesas, painting the sky in slow-burning gold, John reins in at a distant ridge and looks back toward Fort Mercer. He knows now that this will take more than a single visit. It will take allies. It will take patience. It will take the dismantling of a past that refuses to stay buried. The wind moves softly across the desert floor. The Old West is not dead. It is dying. And John Marston rides at the edge of its final breath. The desert morning arrives slowly. Light spills across New Austin in pale gold layers, touching the tops of red rock formations first, before sliding downward into the valleys. The air is cool for only a short while, before the heat begins its steady climb. John Marston wakes beneath open sky. He did not return to Armadillo after Bill's gunfire. Instead, he made camp on a ridge overlooking the desert, far enough from Fort Mercer to avoid patrols, close enough to see its outline against the horizon. He sits upright slowly, rolling his shoulders as the stiffness settles in. The ground is hard beneath him. The world is quiet except for wind and distant birds. He studies Fort Mercer again. Stone walls, guard rotations, patterns. Bill was never the cleverest man in the gang, but he was stubborn. And stubborn men often overestimate the strength of walls. John knows better than to ride back alone. By mid-morning, he is riding toward Armadillo again, dust lifting behind him in a thin, trailing cloud. The town looks even smaller in daylight. Heat bends the air above rooftops. A buzzard circles lazily overhead. Inside the saloon, the piano plays a slow, wandering melody. John steps in and orders coffee this time, not whiskey. His mind needs to remain clear. The local marshal, Lee Johnson, enters soon after. Johnson is broad-shouldered, sun-worn, and practical. He has the look of a man who knows the land better than politics. He recognizes John immediately, not by friendship, but by purpose. Word travels fast in small desert towns. Johnson sits across from him. They speak quietly. Bill's gang has been raiding nearby ranches, stealing cattle, extorting settlers. Fort Mercer gives them leverage, and no one in Armadillo has the manpower to storm it. John explains his position without explaining too much. He needs Bill removed. The marshal needs Bill removed. Their goals align. Johnson leans back slowly, considering. A frontal assault would fail. But Bill's men are reckless when confident. They decide to test the fort again, this time with coordination. Later that afternoon, John rides with Johnson and a handful of deputies across the open desert. The heat presses down hard now, relentless and bright. Sweat gathers at the base of John's neck beneath his collar. They approach from the north side, using low ridges as cover. Fort Mercer stands solid as before. John feels something strange as they near it again. Not fear, not exactly. Recognition. This is the kind of place Dutch would have admired once. A fortress carved from defiance. A stand against the world. Johnson signals. Gunfire erupts suddenly from the ridge. Deputies fire first, catching the guards by surprise. 2 men on the wall fall quickly. The fort stirs to life, shouts echoing across the courtyard. John rides hard toward the gate alongside the deputies. Bullets kick up dirt around them. One deputy is thrown from his horse mid-charge. Another dives for cover behind a rock. The desert becomes noise and smoke. John reaches partial cover near a low stone wall just outside the main gate. He fires steadily, controlled, aiming for precision rather than panic. For a moment, it feels possible. Then Bill appears atop the wall again, calm now, rifle steady. He shouts for his men to flank. More outlaws emerge from hidden positions around the fort's outer perimeter. Johnson curses under his breath. They've underestimated Bill. The deputies begin falling back. John holds his ground a second longer than he should, firing 2 more careful shots before retreating under heavy return fire. The assault collapses. They ride hard back toward Armadillo as bullets chase them across open land. Only when Fort Mercer shrinks into the distance do they slow. Johnson removes his hat and wipes sweat from his brow. "That ain't gonna work," he mutters. John nods quietly. This cannot be done by force alone. The desert stretches wide around them as they return to town. The sun begins its slow descent again, turning everything deep orange. Inside the saloon that evening, John sits alone. The piano plays. Men murmur. Dust drifts through open doors. He studies a crude map drawn in the dirt beside his boot. If Fort Mercer cannot be breached directly, then Bill must be drawn out. John finishes his coffee and stands. The game will need to be played more carefully now. Not with brute force, but with pressure. Outside, the desert wind rises gently as night begins to settle. Fort Mercer glows faintly in the far distance beneath the stars. And John Marston begins planning the slow dismantling of a kingdom built on borrowed loyalty. Night in Armadillo settles like a thin blanket of dust. The town never truly sleeps, but it quiets. Lanterns glow softly in saloon windows. Horses shift in their posts. Wind moves through the narrow street in slow, patient gusts, pushing sand against wooden steps and porch legs. John Marston sits alone outside the saloon long after the piano inside has gone quiet. He studies Fort Mercer from memory now. Stone walls cannot be rushed. Men inside them cannot be reasoned with. But men who believe themselves powerful often grow careless. Bill Williamson has built a fortress, yes, but more importantly, he has built a reputation. And reputations must be maintained. The next morning, John seeks out Marshal Lee Johnson again. The marshal stands outside the jailhouse, adjusting his gun belt, eyes already narrowed against the sun climbing over the horizon. John shares his thinking. Bill will not remain behind walls forever. He raids. He asserts control. He needs to be seen. If the fort cannot be breached directly, then Bill must be drawn into action. Johnson nods slowly. There is a ranch nearby, McFarland's ranch, struggling under pressure from bandits along the roads. The ranch supplies much of the surrounding settlements. If its operations are strengthened, Bill's gang will feel the loss. And Bill will react. John mounts his horse before the heat has fully risen. The ride north toward Hennigan's stead carries him through wide, rolling plains that feel almost peaceful compared to the harsher red desert near Armadillo. Grass moves in gentle waves under a pale sky. Wooden fences stretch long and straight. The air smells faintly of livestock and hay. McFarland's ranch appears on the horizon. Not fortified, not imposing. Just honest land with hard-working hands tending it. John rides through the front gate slowly. A few ranch hands pause their work to look at him, cautious, but not hostile. In the yard stands Bonnie McFarland, steady, capable, sun-worn but strong. She carries herself with confidence that comes from necessity rather than pride. John explains why he is there. Bandits have been attacking supply routes, livestock disappearing, fences cut in the night. Bonnie confirms it. They've lost cattle, lost time, lost sleep. Bill's reach stretches further than his stone walls. John offers help. The first task is simple. Ride out with a small group to guard a herd being driven to market. No guns drawn in dramatic fashion, just steady presence. The ride across open plains feels different than the chaos near Fort Mercer. The sky stretches endlessly above them. Birds drift lazily in the distance. The cattle move slowly, hooves thudding rhythmically against packed dirt. For a while, it feels almost like a different life. Then the riders appear. Small figures on the horizon at first, silhouettes against rising dust. They fan out as they approach. Not disciplined soldiers, but opportunistic outlaws. Men who assume a ranch herd will be poorly guarded. John draws his revolver calmly. The gunfight that follows is sharp but brief. Horses rear. Cattle scatter. Dust explodes upward as bullets strike earth. John moves with measured control, picking targets carefully rather than wildly firing. Within minutes, the bandits break and retreat. The herd is saved. On the morning of the assault, the sun rises hot and merciless. The posse moves in a long line across open desert, dust trailing behind them like a banner. The cannon creaks along in a wagon at the center of the group. No one speaks much. There is no music, no grand speeches, just inevitability. As they crest the ridge overlooking Fort Mercer, the structure stands quiet beneath the blazing sky. Guards patrol lazily along the walls, unaware of how many rifles now watch from above. Johnson gives the signal. The first cannon blast cracks across the desert like thunder. Stone chips away from the outer wall. Dust and smoke burst outward violently. Guards scramble in confusion. Shouts echo within the courtyard. The second blast strikes harder. The main gate splinters. Gunfire erupts from both sides as deputies advance carefully behind rock cover. John moves with them, steady and focused. Bullets tear through dust near his boots, but he does not rush. He fires deliberately. One outlaw falls from the wall. Another drops behind the gate. The cannon roars again. This time, the gate gives way. Wood and iron explode inward, collapsing into the courtyard. The posse charges. Inside Fort Mercer, chaos replaces confidence. Bill's men scatter into defensive positions, firing wildly. Smoke fills the air. Horses scream somewhere near the back stables. John moves through the courtyard with practiced precision. Each corner is checked, each doorway cleared carefully. He does not shout Bill's name. He does not curse. He advances. He sees him at last near the rear building, rifle in hand, face set hard. Bill does not laugh this time. He fires once, the shot striking a deputy beside John. The man falls heavily into the dust. John steadies himself and returns fire. The bullet strikes Bill in the shoulder, spinning him backward against a wooden post. He tries to raise his rifle again, but John closes the distance quickly, knocking the weapon from his hand. They stand face to face in drifting smoke. For a moment, time narrows. Bill looks older than John remembers, harder, but still the same man who once listened to Dutch speak about freedom around a fire. "You picked the wrong side," Bill mutters. John's voice remains calm. "There ain't no sides left." He disarms him fully and steps back as deputies move in to bind Bill's hands. The fight dies down gradually across the courtyard. Survivors surrender. Others flee into open desert. Fort Mercer falls silent. The stone walls that once felt imposing now feel small beneath the open sky. Marshal Johnson approaches, breathing heavy but satisfied. "It's done," he says. John does not celebrate. He watches as Bill is loaded into a wagon, wrists bound, eyes fixed forward in quiet resentment. The desert wind rises again, brushing through broken gates and scattered debris. Ross will hear of this quickly. Bill Williamson has fallen. But John knows the leash remains, because this was never about Bill alone. As the posse rides back toward Armadillo beneath the relentless sun, Fort Mercer shrinks behind them. No longer a fortress, just another ruin swallowed slowly by sand. And in Blackwater, miles away, Agent Edgar Ross prepares to tighten the leash further. The game has only moved forward, not ended. Fort Mercer smolders behind them as the posse rides north. The desert has already begun to reclaim the broken gate, wind brushing sand over splintered wood and chipped stone. The fight is finished, but the land does not remember battles for long. It erases them quietly. Bill Williamson rides in the back of a wagon, wrists bound, posture stiff. He does not look at John. John rides ahead of him, hat low, eyes forward. There is no satisfaction in his expression. By late afternoon, they reach Armadillo. Townsfolk gather cautiously along the boardwalks, watching as Bill is led toward the jailhouse. Some whisper. Some stare openly. The name Williamson still carries weight in these parts. Marshal Lee Johnson tips his hat to John once the prisoner is secured. "You did your part," he says. But John knows better. His part is not done. He waits until dusk before riding north toward Blackwater. The land begins to change again as he leaves New Austin behind. The red desert softens into rolling hills. Trees grow thicker. The air cools slightly. Civilization creeps back in through fences, rail lines, and tidy farmsteads. Blackwater greets him with order. Street lamps glow cleanly against evening sky. Brick buildings rise in confident lines. Well-dressed citizens move along sidewalks with purpose. The frontier feels further away here. John dismounts outside the government building and steps inside without hesitation. Agent Edgar Ross waits behind a polished desk. He looks pleased, but not impressed. Bill's capture is acknowledged with a small nod, nothing more. Ross thanks him in a tone that carries no warmth. Then he moves on. "There's still two," Ross says calmly. "Javier Escuella and Dutch Vanderlinde." The names hang heavy in the air. Ross explains that Javier has fled south across the border into Mexico. Revolution stirs there. Power shifts daily. Javier has attached himself to a faction, using the chaos to shield himself from pursuit. John listens quietly. Ross leans forward slightly. "You'll cross the river," he says. "You'll find him. You'll bring him back." There is no question in it. John thinks briefly of Beecher's hope, of Abigail's steady hands, of Jack reading beneath lamplight, of a life that feels increasingly distant. He nods once. Outside, night has settled fully over Blackwater. The sky glows deep blue above electric streetlights. A train whistle sounds somewhere far off, long and hollow. John boards a train heading west and south the next morning. The countryside rolls past slowly through the window. Fields, hills, grazing cattle, telegraph poles stretching in straight lines across land that once felt untamed. He rests his hat low over his eyes, but does not sleep. Mexico waits ahead. The border crossing feels different than any ride through open territory. The San Luis River runs steady and dark beneath a pale sun. On the far bank, the land rises sharply into dry hills dotted with sparse trees and scattered settlements. The world feels looser there, less controlled, less predictable. John rides across the shallow stretch where the river narrows, water splashing softly against his horse's legs. The current tugs gently at his boots before releasing him onto foreign soil. Mexico smells different, dustier, heavier, charged. Smoke drifts from distant hills. Riders pass on the road without uniform allegiance. Flags fly from buildings that may not fly the same colors tomorrow. Revolution breathes here. John rides into the small town of Escalera by late afternoon. The streets are uneven, the buildings sun-bleached. Soldiers patrol lazily near a central plaza where a fountain trickles weakly in the heat. A local official eyes him with suspicion. An American, alone in revolutionary territory, is not invisible. John asks carefully about Javier Escuella. The name shifts expressions instantly. Javier has aligned himself with a faction led by Colonel Allende, a man clinging to power while rebels gather strength against him. Javier has found shelter in chaos. John understands the pattern. Dutch once thrived in disorder. Javier learned well. As the sun begins to dip behind Mexico's jagged hills, casting long shadows across Escalera's plaza, John stands quietly near the fountain. This land is not New Austin. It will not bend to simple plans. He will need allies again. But this time, alliances will be dangerous. Because in Mexico, every side believes itself righteous, and every deal carries betrayal beneath its surface. The wind moves softly through the plaza. A church bell rings faintly in the distance. And John Marston prepares to step into a revolution not his own. To hunt a man who once sang beside him beneath cold frontier stars. Morning in Escalera arrives with bells and dust. The church tower in the center of town rings softly as sunlight spills over tiled rooftops and cracked adobe walls. The plaza fills slowly with movement. Merchants opening stalls, soldiers pacing lazily along shaded arcades, women carrying baskets of fruit across uneven stone. John stands near the fountain where he spent the previous evening, hat low, hands resting lightly near his belt. The trickle of water is faint against the rising hum of voices and hoofbeats. Mexico feels alive in a different way. Not organized like Blackwater, not sparse like New Austin. Alive with tension. Every conversation feels layered, every uniform uncertain. John makes his way toward the barracks where Colonel Allende's men gather. The soldiers outside watch him carefully. An American riding alone into revolutionary territory draws attention whether he seeks it or not. He is escorted inside after brief questioning. The courtyard beyond is sun-baked and loud with drill commands barked in sharp Spanish. Soldiers move in rigid formation under the watchful gaze of officers. Colonel Allende appears from a shaded doorway. He is polished, boots clean, uniform pressed, posture stiff with authority. His smile is smooth and practiced, but his eyes are sharp and calculating. John speaks plainly. He is looking for Javier Escuella. Allende's smile widens slightly. Javier, he confirms, has been working alongside government forces to suppress rebel activity in the countryside. He is useful, skilled with a rifle, loyal, at least for now. Allende does not refuse John outright. Instead, he proposes something. Mexico is in turmoil. Rebels led by Abraham Reyes are stirring unrest across the northern regions. If John assists the government in stabilizing the territory, Allende may arrange a meeting with Javier. It is not trust, it is leverage. John recognizes it immediately. He nods once. Later that afternoon, John rides out with a small detachment of soldiers toward a rebel-controlled village nestled between dry hills. The land beyond Escalera is rugged, scrub brush clinging to rocky soil, dust rising with every hoofstep. The soldiers are tense. Revolution is unpredictable. They reach the village near dusk. Gunfire erupts almost immediately. Rebels scatter from rooftops and alleyways, rifles flashing in the fading light. The soldiers return fire with disciplined bursts. Smoke hangs heavy in narrow streets as townsfolk flee into doorways. John moves carefully through it all. He is not fighting for Mexico. He is fighting for a meeting. The skirmish ends quickly. The government forces regain control. As the sun slips fully behind the hills, casting the village into dim violet shadow, John stands near a wall scarred by bullets and thinks of Javier. He remembers him young, laughing, strumming a guitar, arguing passionately about loyalty and destiny beneath starlit skies. How easily that world feels distant now. Back in Escalera, Allende congratulates John on his effectiveness. And he keeps his word, partially. He arranges for John to join a supply convoy where Javier is rumored to be riding escort. The convoy departs before sunrise. The road winds through narrow mountain passes, the cliffs rising sharply on either side. Heat gathers quickly in the confined air. Horses snort restlessly. Halfway through the pass, gunfire explodes from above. Rebels. Not small skirmishers this time. Organized fighters led by Abraham Reyes himself. Chaos erupts in the canyon. John dismounts and takes cover behind a wagon wheel. Bullets ricochet off stone. A soldier beside him falls hard into the dust. The sound of echoing gunfire multiplies against rock walls. Through the smoke, John catches a glimpse of him. Javier. Riding along the opposite side of the convoy, rifle steady, posture confident. For a brief moment, their eyes lock across distance and noise. Recognition flickers there. Javier does not hesitate. He fires at the rebels, not at John. The battle rages until the rebels retreat into higher ground, leaving scattered bodies and broken supplies behind. When the dust settles, Javier is gone, vanished into the confusion. John mounts his horse again slowly. Allende will say Javier had other duties. Javier will claim allegiance to survival. But something is clear now. This will not be simple. Javier is not hiding behind stone walls like Bill. He is moving through shifting loyalties in a country tearing itself apart. And John must move with it. As evening settles over the canyon, wind whispering softly through jagged rock, John rides back toward Escalera. Mexico burns slowly beneath the surface. And somewhere within that fire, Javier Escuella waits. Not as a king behind walls, but as a man choosing which side of chaos to stand upon. The hunt has entered unfamiliar ground, and it will demand more than gunfire to end. The nights in Mexico feel heavier than those in New Austin. The air does not cool as cleanly after sunset. It lingers, warm, thick with dust and the faint scent of gunpowder that never quite leaves the hills. In Escalera, lanterns glow along balconies overlooking the plaza, casting long amber shadows over uneven stone. John Marston stands beneath one of those balconies, watching soldiers move in restless patrols. The canyon skirmish had confirmed something important. Javier is not a prisoner. He is not hiding. He is choosing sides in a revolution that shifts like desert wind. Colonel Allende receives John again the following morning in his shaded office. The shutters are half drawn against the rising heat. A map of northern Mexico lies stretched across the desk, marked with inked lines and red circles. Allende speaks calmly. The rebels, led by Abraham Reyes, are gaining ground in the countryside. Supply lines are being disrupted. Garrisons are being attacked at night. The government needs reliable men to help suppress the unrest. "And Javier?" John asks quietly. Allende smiles faintly. "He is loyal. For now." The words are smooth, but they carry warning. If John wants Javier, he must step deeper into this war. By midday, John rides out again, this time toward Chuparosa, a village rumored to be sympathetic to the rebels. The road winds through dry scrubland where small cacti cling stubbornly to life. Buzzards circle overhead, lazy but watchful. The land feels brittle, ready to crack. As John approaches the outskirts of Chuparosa, he sees signs of tension immediately. Barricades have been erected along narrow streets. Windows are shuttered. Men with rifles linger in doorways, eyes sharp. Rebel territory. John dismounts slowly near the edge of town, raising his hands slightly in a gesture of neutrality. He does not wear a government uniform. He carries no flag. He carries only his purpose. A young man steps forward from the crowd. Dark hair, sunburned face, determination flickering in his eyes. Abraham Reyes. He is charismatic in a different way than Dutch once was. Less theatrical, more urgent. He speaks of oppression, of Allende's cruelty, of villages burned in the name of order. John listens. He has heard speeches like this before. Reyes offers him something Allende never would: help the rebels, undermine the government. And when the revolution tips in their favor, Reyes will deliver Javier Escuella. It is the same bargain dressed in different colors. John understands the pattern. In Mexico, loyalty is temporary. Power is survival. Still, he agrees. Not because he believes in Reyes, but because movement brings him closer to Javier. Over the next several days, John rides alongside rebel fighters through narrow mountain passes and into isolated outposts. They sabotage supply trains under cover of darkness. They ambush patrols in dry riverbeds where sound carries strangely in the night. The gunfights are brutal and close. Mexico does not fight in neat lines. It fights from rooftops, from shadows, from behind church bells and adobe walls. One evening, after a successful raid on a government convoy, John sits alone near a small fire on the edge of a hillside camp. Rebel fighters laugh and drink nearby, celebrating small victories that feel larger than they are. The sky above Mexico is enormous. Stars scatter thick across blackness. John thinks of Javier again, of the guitar music drifting softly across prairie nights years ago, of arguments about loyalty that once felt abstract. Here, loyalty is not abstract. It is currency. The next morning brings word that Javier is stationed at a fortified hacienda deeper in the hills, a staging ground for government forces attempting to push back the rebels. Reyes sees opportunity. If they strike the hacienda hard enough, Javier will be forced into the open. The ride toward the hacienda is long and quiet. The terrain grows steeper, rockier. Mesas rise like ancient guardians against the horizon. The hacienda itself comes into view near dusk, white walls glowing faintly beneath fading sunlight, guards posted at high windows. Rebel fighters position themselves along surrounding ridges. John checks his revolver carefully. The assault begins just after sunset. Rebels fire from the hills, drawing government forces into confusion. Torches flare along the hacienda walls as soldiers scramble to respond. Smoke rises quickly into darkening sky. John moves toward the courtyard entrance with a small unit, ducking behind stone walls as bullets snap past his ears. The air fills with the sharp metallic scent of gunfire. Inside the courtyard, chaos unfolds. Soldiers and rebels clash at close range. Horses scream in stables. Windows shatter. And there, near the far archway, Javier Escuella. He stands firm, revolver drawn, issuing orders in rapid Spanish. His posture is controlled, focused. He sees John. This time, there is no distance between them. For a moment, the battle fades into background noise. Javier's expression shifts. Not surprise, not anger. Recognition. John steps forward slowly through drifting smoke. "Don't make me chase you again," he says quietly. Javier's jaw tightens. "You always were the one who followed orders," he replies. There is no laughter now. Only truth cutting through old memory. Gunfire erupts between them as rebels surge through the courtyard. Javier fires once, not at John, but at a rebel approaching from the side. He retreats toward the rear gate under covering fire. John pursues. Through narrow corridors, across broken tiles, out into the dark hills beyond. But Javier knows this land better now. He vanishes into the night as quickly as dust carried by wind. The hacienda falls to the rebels behind John. Flames lick at its outer walls. Reyes celebrates loudly. But John stands at the edge of the hills, staring into darkness. Javier slipped away again. This is no longer about politics. No longer about rebels or colonels. It is personal. As wind brushes gently across rocky slopes and distant fires crackle behind him, John understands something clearly. To capture Javier, he must cut off the ground beneath him. And in Mexico, ground shifts easily. The revolution continues to burn, and John Marston rides deeper into its fire. The hacienda burns through the night. Flames rise high against the dark hills, orange light licking at whitewashed walls until they crumble inward. The sound of celebration carries from the rebel camp below. Laughter, shouted toasts, the crackle of victory earned in blood. But John Marston does not celebrate. He stands alone on a ridge overlooking the ruined estate, the wind pushing warm smoke across his coat. Somewhere out there, beyond the glow of firelight and the cheers of Abraham Reyes's men, Javier Escuella is riding. Again. Mexico does not hold still long enough for clean endings. By morning, the rebel camp has shifted. The fighters break down tents quickly, loading rifles and ammunition into saddlebags with practiced efficiency. Reyes speaks loudly about momentum, about pushing further south, about seizing the advantage while Allende regroups. John approaches him quietly. "You said you'd help me get to Escuela." Reyes wipes sweat from his brow, eyes bright with ambition. "And I will," he insists. "But the colonel is still strong. Javier is close to him. We must weaken the army further." It is always one more fight, one more village, one more favor. John has learned to hear the truth beneath those promises. If Javier remains useful to Allende, he remains protected. The only way forward is to make that protection crumble. So John rides again. The next target lies in the mountains near El Presidio, a fortified prison where Allende's loyalists regroup and hold captured rebels. The structure rises from a rocky plateau like a crown of stone, overlooking dry valleys on all sides. Breaking it would humiliate the colonel and flush out his lieutenants. The ride there takes 2 days, through canyons carved deep by time, across narrow bridges suspended over dry ravines, past villages emptied by fear. The closer they draw to El Presidio, the heavier the tension becomes. The prison is well defended. Guards patrol the outer walls in pairs. Searchlights sweep slowly across open ground at night. The gates are iron-bound and thick. This will not be like the hacienda. This will be war. Under cover of darkness, Reyes's fighters position themselves along the surrounding cliffs. John crouches behind a jagged rock outcrop, studying the wall through the faint glow of lanterns. He feels something old stir inside him. Not excitement. Focus. The kind he once felt riding alongside Dutch before a major score. But this is different. There is no dream here. Only consequence. The attack begins with a coordinated volley from the cliffs. Rifles crack in unison. Guards drop from the walls. Alarms ring sharply across the courtyard. Searchlights swing wildly, beams slicing through darkness. Rebel fighters charge from the hillsides. John moves with them, steady and controlled, using the chaos to close distance toward the main gate. An explosion shatters part of the outer wall, opening a narrow breach. Smoke pours outward in thick clouds. Inside, the prison courtyard erupts into close quarters fighting. Soldiers fire from balconies and stairwells. Prisoners shout from barred windows. Horses rear in confusion. John moves methodically through it all, clearing corridors, advancing step by careful step. In the central yard, near a raised platform overlooking the cells, he sees him again. Javier. This time there is no distance, no canyon, no smoke to hide behind. Javier stands firm, rifle raised, issuing orders to retreating soldiers. Their eyes meet across the courtyard. The noise seems to dull for a moment. "You don't have to do this," Javier calls out. John's voice remains low, even under gunfire. "You know I do." Javier fires first. The bullet grazes John's shoulder, tearing cloth and skin. Pain flares briefly, sharp and hot, but John steadies himself and returns fire. Javier retreats up a stone staircase toward the upper level of the prison walls. John pursues. The climb is narrow and steep. Gunfire echoes violently against stone. Rebel fighters flood the lower yard as soldiers begin to scatter. At the top of the wall, under a sky just beginning to pale with early dawn, the two men face each other again. Wind whips across the high battlement. Below them, revolution roars. Javier lowers his rifle slightly. "You think they'll let you go when this is done?" he asks. It is not mockery. It is something close to pity. John does not answer. He raises his weapons steadily. The shot rings out against open sky. Javier falls backward against the stone parapet, sliding slowly to the ground. Silence creeps in gradually as the fighting below subsides. El Presidio is taken. Rebels flood the courtyard, celebrating the prison's fall. Reyes climbs the central platform, shouting promises of a free Mexico. John stands alone on the battlement, looking down at Javier's still form. He feels no triumph, only weight. Another chapter closed. Another ghost laid down. But one name remains: Dutch van der Linde. As dawn spreads across the Mexican hills, washing them in pale gold, John descends the staircase slowly. He knows what comes next. Ross will not be satisfied until the last piece falls. And Dutch does not hide behind armies. He hides in ideals. The revolution cheers below, but John Marston feels the quiet tightening of the leash once more. Mexico fades behind him. The final hunt waits ahead. Back across the river. Back where the frontier once felt endless. And where Dutch van der Linde still walks beneath a shrinking sky. The river feels colder on the return. John rides through the shallow crossing at dawn, the San Luis running dark and steady around his horse's legs. Mexico rises behind him in pale morning light. Distant hills softened by haze, smoke drifting faintly where revolution still simmers. He does not look back for long. Javier is gone. Another ghost folded into the earth. The leash tightens. On the northern bank, New Austin greets him with its familiar dryness. The desert stretches wide and open beneath a growing sun. The air smells of dust and brittle grass. It feels almost peaceful compared to the violence he leaves behind. Almost. Blackwater lies further north, polished and orderly as ever. John rides there without ceremony, boots thudding against the wooden boardwalk outside the federal building. Agent Edgar Ross waits, as if he always does. He studies John's bandaged shoulder briefly, then nods once. "Escuella?" he asks. John answers plainly. Ross does not smile. There is no congratulation, only continuation. That leaves one. Dutch van der Linde. The name carries more than the others. Bill was force. Javier was loyalty bent by survival. Dutch was belief. Ross explains what little they know. Dutch has resurfaced in tall trees, the thick forests west of Blackwater. He has gathered a small group of followers, not an army, not a fortress, just a scattering of men who still believe in something. He has been robbing payroll transports, sabotaging rail lines, stirring unrest among laborers and displaced settlers. He speaks of injustice. He always did. John listens quietly. Tall Trees is not open desert. It is dense forest, shadows, hidden trails, Dutch's kind of ground. By late afternoon, John rides west. The land changes gradually as he leaves Blackwater's outskirts behind. Plains give way to rising hills. Trees grow thicker, taller, darker. Pine needles carpet the forest floor. The air cools beneath the canopy, filtered sunlight falling in scattered beams. Tall Trees feels older than the desert, less forgiving, less predictable. The first sign of Dutch's presence comes in the form of a burned wagon near a forest trail. The wheels are charred. Crates lie shattered. A payroll chest sits open and empty beside it. A message carved into a nearby tree catches John's eye. "We are not yet done." Dutch's voice without sound. John dismounts and kneels beside the wagon tracks. Fresh hoofprints lead deeper into the woods. He follows. The forest grows quieter the further he rides. Birds scatter at his approach. Wind moves softly through high branches. The ground is uneven, roots pushing through earth like knotted veins. As dusk approaches, gunfire cracks suddenly through the trees. John ducks instinctively, sliding from the saddle behind thick trunk cover. Bullets strike bark inches from his shoulder. Smoke curls faintly through the undergrowth. Dutch's men. They do not charge. They vanish, firing once or twice before retreating into the trees. Guerrilla tactics. John advances slowly, rifle raised, but sees only shadows shifting between trunks. The forest swallows movement easily. After several minutes, the gunfire ceases. Silence returns. Too easily. He knows this pattern. Dutch does not confront directly. He destabilizes. He draws men into confusion and frustration until they make mistakes. John does not chase blindly. Instead, he rides toward a small logging camp on the forest's edge, where word has spread of Dutch preaching to displaced workers. The camp sits near a narrow river bend. Rough cabins line the clearing. Smoke rises from chimneys. Men move about slowly, axes slung over shoulders. John arrives just before full dark. He sees Dutch standing near the central fire, older now, bearded, eyes still sharp. He speaks calmly to the gathered workers, of corporations taking land, of railroads cutting through forests without mercy, of a government that builds cities while men like these lose everything. The words carry weight. Dutch always knew how to find wounded ears. John steps forward from the tree line. The workers turn. Dutch sees him immediately. There is no surprise in his expression, only something almost like inevitability. "You took your time," Dutch says quietly. The workers disperse slowly, uneasy but not panicked. The two men stand facing one another across flickering firelight. The forest hums softly around them. "You don't have to keep doing this," John says. Dutch smiles faintly. "They made you their pet, didn't they?" There is no anger in his tone, only disappointment. John does not argue. He does not mention Ross. He does not mention Abigail or Jack. He simply watches the man who once stood at the center of his world. The fire crackles between them. The forest waits. Dutch turns away slowly. "This world doesn't want men like us anymore," he says over his shoulder. but I ain't ready to lay down." He disappears into the trees with quiet ease. John does not pursue. Not yet. He knows this will not end in a forest clearing. Dutch will not be taken easily. He never was. As night fully settles over tall trees, wind whispering through pine needles, John stands alone by the dying fire. The final hunt has begun. Not against a fortress, not against a revolution, but against an idea. And ideas are harder to kill than men. Tall trees does not welcome strangers. The forest swallows sound and shape alike, turning men into shadows and trails into questions. Morning light filters weakly through the canopy, breaking into thin golden shafts that barely reach the mossy floor. The air smells of pine sap and damp earth, thick, quiet, ancient. John Marston rides slowly along a narrow logging trail. He does not hurry. He knows Dutch is watching. A snapped branch here, a faint shift in leaves there. Boot prints partially obscured but still visible to a careful eye. Dutch has gathered more than desperate laborers. He has gathered believers. Men cast aside by rail companies. Men injured in industrial accidents. Men who once worked land, now fenced off by wire and law. Dutch speaks to them the way he once spoke to John and Arthur, about a world that moves too fast, about dignity stolen, about fighting back. The difference now is scale. The world truly has moved on. Telephones ring in Blackwater offices. Banks rise from brick foundations. Governments grow larger and more organized. Dutch fights an age. John tracks him deeper into the forest until he reaches a small clearing near a river bend. Smoke drifts from a crude camp. Supplies are scattered loosely. Crates, blankets, ammunition boxes. Dutch's current refuge. John dismounts quietly, rifle ready. Gunfire erupts from the trees before he reaches the clearing. Dutch's men move with surprising discipline, not rushing, but flanking carefully. Bullets strike bark and dirt in controlled bursts. John dives behind a fallen log. The firefight stretches longer than expected. These are not reckless bandits. They are men defending a belief. John fires carefully, dropping one attacker near a tree line, forcing others to retreat. The forest amplifies each shot, echoing it strangely until direction feels distorted. Eventually, the resistance thins. John advances toward the clearing. Dutch stands near the riverbank, revolver in hand, calm amid the chaos. "You're getting good at this," Dutch says, almost conversationally. John steps forward, breathing steady. "It don't have to end like this." Dutch laughs softly. "That's what you said the first time you left." There is history layered beneath every word. Dutch gestures toward the river. "They're stealing land, John. They're building cities on bones, and you're helping them." John does not deny the truth in it. But he also sees something else now. "You're just leaving bodies behind, too." Dutch's expression tightens. For a moment, silence stretches between them, broken only by the slow current of water against rock. Then gunfire cracks from behind John, reinforcements from Blackwater lawmen who have tracked him here. Dutch's eyes flicker toward the sound. "Always someone else's leash," he murmurs. He fires twice toward the approaching deputies, then retreats across the riverbank, disappearing into dense forest once more. John curses under his breath and gives chase, splashing through the shallow water. But Dutch knows tall trees. He vanishes again. By late afternoon, the deputies regroup with John near the burned-out camp. They are frustrated, angry. "He can't keep slipping through like this," one of them mutters. John knows why he can. Dutch never commits fully. He strikes, he speaks, he disappears. The forest works with him. Back in Blackwater that evening, Ross receives the report with thin patience. "Pressure him," Ross says. "Destroy his support. Remove his options." John understands the strategy. Dutch thrives where sympathy exists. Cut that away, and he becomes exposed. Over the next several days, John works systematically. He escorts payroll shipments safely through tall trees. He protects logging camps from sabotage. He captures several of Dutch's followers and delivers them to Blackwater's jail. With each loss, Dutch's circle tightens. The forest grows quieter. Less smoke. Fewer whispers. One evening, as dusk settles thick and blue over the trees, John rides alone along a ridge overlooking the forest valley. Below him, faint lantern light flickers from a small abandoned mine entrance carved into the hillside. Dutch's last refuge. John feels it before he knows it. The hunt is narrowing. The forest is losing its hiding places. He dismounts slowly and begins the descent. Pine needles crunch softly beneath his boots. The air grows cooler near the mine entrance, the scent of damp stone replacing pine. Inside, the tunnel stretches dark and narrow. A lantern flickers faintly deeper within. John steps forward cautiously. The final confrontation is close now. Not beneath open sky, not before cheering followers, but in shadow, where ideas grow thin, and men must face what remains when belief is stripped away. The mine breathes cold air. It rolls outward in a slow, steady draft that smells of damp stone and old timber. The forest sounds fade behind John as he steps inside. The chirp of insects, the whisper of wind through pine needles, all swallowed by shadow. His boots echo faintly against packed dirt. A lantern burns somewhere deeper within, its light flickering weakly against rough-cut beams that hold the tunnel in place. Water drips steadily from the ceiling, marking time in hollow rhythm. John moves carefully. Dutch does not hide without preparation. Halfway down the tunnel, gunfire explodes from the darkness ahead. The first shot ricochets off stone near John's shoulder. He dives behind a support beam, splinters cracking as bullets tear into wood. Dutch's men, the few who remain. The firefight inside the mine is close and brutal. Smoke thickens the narrow air. Muzzle flashes blind in tight bursts. John fires deliberately, each shot measured to conserve ammunition. One outlaw rushes from behind a crate and falls before reaching him. Another retreats deeper into a side shaft. Footsteps echo in confusion. The space amplifies every sound. Gunshots ringing twice as loud, breath coming harder than usual. Eventually, the resistance fades. Silence returns in slow increments. John steps over fallen bodies and advances toward the flickering lantern at the far end of the tunnel. The main chamber opens up suddenly, a wider cavern where old mining equipment sits abandoned. A broken cart lies tipped on its side. Rusted rails run toward a shaft, descending further into darkness. Dutch stands near the edge of that shaft. Lantern light catches his face from below, carving deep shadows across his features. He looks older here, not weaker, but tired. "You followed me into a hole in the ground," Dutch says softly. "That's fitting." John lowers his rifle slightly, though he does not put it away. It's over. Dutch studies him. "You believe that?" The mine hums faintly around them. Dutch steps closer to the edge of the shaft, peering down into blackness. "You remember what I used to say?" he asks. "We're living in a world that don't want us." I was right. John says nothing. Dutch turns slowly. "They use you, John. They'll use you until there's nothing left to take." There is no anger in his voice, only clarity. "You think Bill or Javier mattered to them?" Dutch continues. "You think I matter? It's not about us. It's about control." John feels the truth of it like weight pressing down. But he also sees the wreckage left behind. "You had your chance," he replies quietly. "We all did." Dutch smiles faintly. "Arthur believed in you," he says. The name lands heavily in the cavern. John's grip tightens around his rifle. "You ever think about that?" Dutch continues. "He believed you could live different. I believed you'd come back." A long silence stretches between them. The mind feels smaller now, darker. John steps forward slowly. "I ain't here to argue." Dutch glances down at the shaft again. Water drips. Somewhere deeper in the mine, stone shifts faintly. "I gave them everything," Dutch says. "My time, my words, my fight. And they still call me outlaw." John doesn't respond, because there is no answer to that. Dutch looks at him one final time. "You want to be free?" he asks softly. "Jump." And before John can step forward, Dutch steps backward into the darkness. There is no gunshot, no struggle, just the sudden absence of him. A long, echoing fall. Then silence. John stands frozen at the edge of the shaft, lantern light trembling slightly in his hand. He does not look down immediately. He already knows. When he finally does, Dutch lies motionless below, small and still against stone. The last of the Vanderlinde gang. Gone. The mine feels impossibly quiet. The world above continues to turn. John climbs back toward the entrance slowly, each step heavier than the last. Outside, tall trees stands unchanged beneath the setting sun. Pine branches sway gently in evening wind. Birds circle lazily above. Deputies approach from the tree line, rifles lowered. "It's done?" one asks. John nods once. No celebration follows. No cheers. Only the rustle of wind through forest. As twilight deepens into blue, John mounts his horse and rides back toward Blackwater. The hunt is over. Bill, Javier, Dutch, all gone. The leash should fall away now. It should. But as the lights of Blackwater begin to glow in the distance, steady and organized against the dark, John feels something else instead. Not freedom, not relief, but waiting. Because men like Ross do not release what they control. And somewhere beyond those clean brick buildings and polished offices, a final betrayal gathers quietly beneath electric light. The forest fades behind him, and the age of outlaws ends not with gunfire, but with a fall into darkness. Tall trees fades behind him in deepening blue. The forest does not mourn. It simply continues. Wind through pine needles, river running steady over rock, dusk settling as it always has. If a legend died in that mine, the trees do not speak of it. John Marston rides slowly back toward Blackwater. The weight of what has happened does not strike him all at once. It comes in waves. In the way his shoulders feel heavier. In the way the evening air seems sharper against his skin. Dutch is gone. Not captured. Not judged. Gone by his own choice. John replays the final moments in his mind as the road unwinds before him. The lantern light. The echo of Dutch's voice in the cavern. The word Arthur spoken in shadow. Arthur believed in you. The memory presses harder than the gunfire ever did. By the time Blackwater's lamps begin to glow in the distance, night has fully taken hold. The town shines against the dark countryside like something separate from the wild. Orderly, electric, contained. John rides into town without ceremony. He does not look left or right. He goes straight to the Federal Building. Inside, the air feels still and polished. Clean floors, neatly stacked papers. A clock ticking softly somewhere deeper in the office. Agent Edgar Ross stands near a window, hands folded behind his back as though he has been waiting. He turns slowly as John enters. "Well?" Ross asks, calm as ever. John removes his hat, holding it loosely at his side. "It's done." Ross studies him for a long moment, searching his face for something. Satisfaction, perhaps, or defiance. He finds neither. "And Vanderlinde?" Ross presses. "Dead." Ross nods once. There is no triumph in his expression, only completion. He steps toward his desk, shuffling a few documents into a neat stack. "You've done your country a great service, Mr. Marston." The words sound rehearsed. John does not answer. Ross walks around the desk slowly, stopping a few feet away. "You understand, of course," he continues, "that men like you are complicated." The air shifts slightly, subtle, unsettling. "You've been useful," Ross says, "and usefulness has value." John feels it then. Not relief, not gratitude. A pause. A space where something should be granted, but is not. Ross tips his head faintly. "You may return home." That is all. No written pardon, no formal absolution, no guarantee spoken aloud. Just dismissal. John replaces his hat slowly. He does not thank Ross. He does not shake his hand. He turns and walks back into the night. Outside, Blackwater moves on as if nothing monumental has occurred. Carriages roll past. Laughter drifts from a restaurant window. The world has grown comfortable with its own progress. John boards the morning train west. The countryside slides past again, hills softening into plains, plains widening toward familiar land. He sits quietly, watching telegraph wires flicker by in steady rhythm. For the first time in months, there is no immediate target, no next name, no direction given. Only home. Beecher's Hope rises slowly on the horizon that afternoon, the ranch standing steady beneath wide sky. The barn catches golden sunlight. Smoke curls gently from the chimney. John reins in at the gate and pauses. The wind moves through tall grass the same way it always has. Abigail steps out onto the porch. For a heartbeat, she does not move. Then she walks toward him. He dismounts slowly. There are no dramatic speeches, no long explanations. She reads it in his eyes. It's over. Jack emerges from the doorway moments later, taller than John remembers him being, book still tucked beneath one arm. The three of them stand there in the open yard as the sun lowers behind distant hills. For the first time since stepping off that train in Blackwater,
John feels something settle inside him. Stillness. Not freedom yet, but stillness. The ranch feels smaller than it once did, not because it has changed, but because the world beyond it has grown louder. Rail lines expand, cities grow, governments tighten their grip. But here, for now, there is quiet. That night, John sits on the porch long after Abigail and Jack have gone inside. The stars stretch wide across the sky, the same stars he once rode beneath as an outlaw, the same stars Arthur watched during quiet nights at camp. The wind brushes softly across the fields. Dutch's voice echoes faintly in memory. You want to be free? Jump. John leans back in his chair, boots resting on the porch rail. He did not jump. He endured. And for the first time in years, there is no one left to chase. But somewhere, far from Beecher's Hope, in a polished office in Blackwater, Agent Edgar Ross closes a file and sets it aside. Not destroyed, not erased, just placed carefully within reach. Because usefulness has value, and usefulness can expire. The night deepens over the ranch. The fire inside burns low, and peace settles softly. Fragile, uncertain, borrowed.
The days that followed John's return passed with an almost unsettling quiet. Beecher's Hope did not change in appearance, yet it felt different, in the way a room feels different after someone leaves it for good. The barn still leaned slightly against the western wind. The fencing still required small repairs along the southern line. The cattle still moved slowly across open pasture beneath a wide and forgiving sky. But there was a stillness beneath the routine that John could not entirely ignore. He rose before sunrise each morning, as he had done during the years before Ross ever appeared at his door. The habit had become part of him. He would step onto the porch while the world remained dim and blue, watching the horizon brighten in slow layers of gold. The air at that hour was clean and cool, carrying the scent of grass and distant water. Abigail would wake shortly after, her footsteps soft inside the house as she prepared breakfast. Jack had grown into a quiet young man, thoughtful and observant, often seen reading beneath the tree near the barn when his chores were finished. There was peace in the smallness of their life. John tried to lean into it. He mended fences without urgency. He repaired tools with careful patience. He rode the perimeter of the property in wide arcs, not because he feared intrusion, but because he could. There were no more names to hunt, no more targets handed to him beneath government lamplight. For the first time in years, the rhythm of his days belonged only to him. Yet, at night, when the wind moved across the plains and the stars stretched endlessly above, he found himself awake longer than he admitted. Lying beside Abigail, listening to the distant call of coyotes, he would replay certain moments in his mind. Dutch's fall into darkness, Javier's final glance across the battlement, Bill's resentment in the desert courtyard. He had done what was asked, but Ross had never spoken the word pardon. Weeks passed. Then one morning, as the sun rose in familiar gold over the eastern ridge, John noticed something small but wrong. Dust on the horizon. Not the drifting kind carried by wind, but the steady plume made by horses riding in formation. He set down his hammer slowly and walked toward the edge of the yard. Abigail stepped onto the porch behind him, sensing the shift before she saw it. The riders approached without haste, uniformed, organized, deliberate. John recognized the posture before he recognized the faces. Government men. When they stopped at the edge of his property, the lead rider removed his hat. Agent Edgar Ross. He looked almost pleasant beneath the morning light. John did not move to greet him. Ross dismounted and walked forward at an easy pace, boots crunching lightly against gravel. "I trust you've been enjoying the quiet," Ross said calmly. John kept his voice steady. "You said I was done." Ross smiled faintly, the expression never quite reaching his eyes. "And you were useful." The words landed with careful precision. Behind Ross, more riders began to fan out across the perimeter of the ranch. Not aggressively, not yet, but strategically. Abigail stepped closer to John, her hand brushing lightly against his arm. Ross removed a folded document from his coat pocket, though he did not hand it over. "There are complications," he said. "Loose ends. Men who were once part of a certain organization. The public must be reassured that the age of outlaws is well and truly over." John understood before the explanation finished. He had not been pardoned. He had been preserved. Preserved until the final example could be made. Ross looked toward the house briefly, then back at John. "You've had your time," he said softly. There was no anger in John then, no panic. Only a deep, steady awareness settling into his chest. He had known, somewhere beneath hope, that men like Ross did not forgive pasts. They archived them. The wind moved gently through the grass between them. Jack stood in the doorway now, confusion in his young face. Abigail's fingers tightened slightly against John's sleeve. Ross replaced his hat. "We'll give you time to gather your thoughts," he said. Then he turned and walked back toward his horse. The riders did not leave. They remained at the edges of Beecher's Hope, positioned just far enough to seem patient, but close enough to ensure control. John stood in the yard long after Ross had mounted. The ranch looked exactly as it had an hour before. The same barn, the same fence, the same open sky. But the stillness had shifted. Peace had not returned. It had been measured, and its measure had expired. The riders did not advance immediately. They waited. Beecher's Hope sat in the quiet of late morning, the air still and bright beneath a wide, indifferent sky. The fence lines cast long shadows across the yard, and the barn door creaked softly in the breeze. Everything looked unchanged. Everything looked peaceful. John stood near the house, watching Agent Ross and the line of uniformed men fanned out across his land. There was no mistaking the formation. This was not conversation. It was conclusion. Abigail stepped closer to him, her voice low and tight. Jack stood just behind her, confusion and dawning understanding mingling across his young face. "You said they were done," Abigail whispered. John did not answer immediately. He kept his eyes on Ross. "I was useful," he said quietly at last. "That's all." The riders shifted slightly, rifles resting at the ready. Ross adjusted his gloves with calm precision, as though this were a matter of paperwork rather than execution. John turned back toward the house. "Go," he said. Abigail stared at him. "John." "Go," he repeated, more firmly now. "Take Jack, get to the barn, ride north. Don't look back." There was something final in his tone that left no room for argument. Abigail gripped his coat for a moment, her eyes searching his face for something that might change. But she saw only resolve.
She nodded once, took Jack's hand, and moved quickly toward the barn. John followed them inside. The barn was dim, dust floating in shafts of light that slipped between the wooden boards. The horses shifted nervously, sensing the tension outside. Abigail mounted first, pulling Jack up behind her. John opened the rear doors of the barn slowly. Sunlight poured in from the far side of the property, illuminating a narrow path toward open land. "You ride hard," he said. "You don't stop." Jack's jaw trembled slightly, but he nodded. Abigail held John's gaze for one long, unbroken moment. No words passed between them. There was nothing left to say that had not already been lived. Then she spurred the horse forward. Hooves thundered across the back field as they rode north, disappearing beyond the ridge. John closed the rear doors. The barn grew quiet again. Outside, Agent Ross's men began to move into position around the front of the building. John walked toward the main doors of the barn and rested his hand briefly against the wood. The grain felt solid beneath his palm. This place had been built board by board with the intention of permanence. He had believed in it. He drew his revolver. Then he stepped outside. The light was harsh after the dimness of the barn. The yard stretched wide before him, and beyond it stood a line of soldiers, rifles raised and aimed directly at his chest. Ross stood slightly behind them, calm and watchful. John did not run. He did not seek cover. He looked at the men in front of him, then briefly toward the horizon where Abigail and Jack had vanished. For a fraction of a second, everything held still. Then time resumed. John lifted his revolver and fired. The first shot dropped one of the soldiers near the center of the line. The second struck another before he could steady his aim. The world erupted in thunder as the remaining rifles discharged all at once. The force of the volley drove him backward. Bullets struck with brutal finality, tearing through coat and flesh. His revolver fell from his hand as his knees buckled beneath him. He collapsed into the dust of his own yard. The sky above him was impossibly blue. Gunsmoke drifted slowly in the air, thinning as the wind carried it away. The soldiers lowered their rifles one by one. Ross stepped forward, studying the still figure on the ground with quiet satisfaction.
There were no speeches, no last words. Only the vast openness of the plains stretching endlessly beyond the ranch. The men mounted their horses and rode away. Beecher's hope fell silent once more. John Marston lay where he had fallen, beneath the same wide sky he had once hoped would shelter his family from the world's reach. The age of outlaws did not end in glory. It ended in a single overwhelming volley beneath the open sun. The riders did not look back as they left Beecher's hope behind them. Their formation loosened once they reached the main road, hooves settling into a steady rhythm as the ranch disappeared over the southern rise. Dust rose in pale clouds beneath the morning sun, thinning gradually as they rode toward Blackwater. Agent Ross remained silent at the front of the column, his posture upright and composed, as though the morning's work had been no more than administrative. Behind them, the ranch stood in unnatural quiet. The barn door hung slightly ajar where bullets had splintered the wood. The fence along the western edge leaned inward, a section shattered from rifle fire. The trough beside the well lay cracked, water pooling slowly into dark soil. And in the open space between house and barn, John Marston remained where he had fallen, the grass around him stirring gently in the wind. The sun climbed higher. By mid-morning, a neighboring ranch hand, having heard distant gunfire, approached cautiously along the northern trail. He removed his hat when he saw the scene and dismounted slowly, boots sinking into dust as he walked toward the yard. There was no urgency in his movement, only the heavy understanding that comes after violence has already concluded. He stood there for a long moment before turning toward the house, calling softly into its empty doorway. No one answered. Word spread quietly through the surrounding countryside by afternoon. Not as gossip, not as spectacle, but as acknowledgement. Men who had once ridden with John, men who had worked beside him, men who had simply known him as the rancher on the hill. They spoke of it in low voices. No one spoke Ross's name loudly. Civilization had rules now, and those rules had uniforms. It was near dusk when Abigail and Jack returned. They rode slowly at first, uncertain of what they might find. The northern trail felt longer than it ever had, the horizon stretching endlessly ahead. Abigail's hands were steady on the reins, but her jaw remained set with a tension that had not eased since she left that morning. Jack rode slightly behind her, his expression drawn tight with something he had not yet learned how to express. They saw the damage before they saw him. The broken fence, the splintered boards, the silence. Abigail urged her horse forward, dread hardening into certainty as the yard came fully into view. She dismounted before the horse had fully stopped, boots hitting the dirt with a dull thud. Jack followed more slowly, his steps measured, as though moving too quickly might make the moment irreversible. John lay where he had fallen. The light of evening had softened the harshness of morning. The sky now held warm tones of amber and violet, the wind brushing through tall grass with gentle indifference. Abigail knelt beside him and placed her hand against his coat, her fingers trembling only once before steadying. There were no tears at first, only the stillness of recognition. Jack stood a few feet away, hat held tightly in both hands. The world felt larger than it ever had, and emptier. They buried him at the edge of the property the following day. The grave was simple, marked by wood and careful hands. Abigail did not allow spectacle. She stood firm beside Jack as the small gathering of neighbors removed their hats and bowed their heads. The wind carried the scent of dry earth and distant river water as the final shovelful fell into place. When the others departed, Abigail remained beside the grave longer than the rest. Jack watched her quietly. The ranch no longer felt like shelter. It felt like inheritance. The weeks that followed passed in muted rhythm. Abigail tended to the house and livestock with determined calm. Jack worked the fields beside her, his movements quieter than before, his shoulders straightening in subtle shifts of adulthood. But something had changed in him. The books he once read beneath the tree near the barn lay unopened more often now. Instead, he practiced with his father's revolver behind the barn, his stance deliberate, his aim steady. Abigail saw it and said nothing at first, though the weight of it pressed heavily against her chest. One evening, as twilight settled softly over Beecher's Hope, Jack stood at his father's grave and read aloud from a worn novel he had once been reading when Ross first arrived. His voice carried across the open fields, gentle and steady, as though sharing the words with the wind itself. The age of outlaws had ended, but the age of consequence had not. Months later, as winter began to approach and frost touched the edges of the fields at dawn, Abigail's health declined quietly. The strain of years, of running, of waiting, of fearing, had carved deeper marks than she ever admitted. She passed one morning in the same house she had fought so hard to keep standing, her hand resting near the window where sunlight spilled gently across the floorboards. Jack buried her beside John. The two graves stood side by side beneath open sky, the wind moving across them in steady rhythm. Jack Marston remained alone at Beecher's Hope after that. He grew into the land the way a tree grows into soil, slowly, deeply, with roots anchored in memory. He worked the fields. He maintained the fences. He rode the perimeter at dawn, much as his father had done. But the world beyond the ranch continued its steady march forward. Rail lines expanded, cities grew, telegraph wires multiplied. And in Blackwater, Agent Edgar Ross lived comfortably, his service record polished and filed away. Years passed. Jack grew taller, his features sharpening into something that resembled both his parents. The softness of childhood left his face, replaced by quiet resolve. On a cool afternoon in early autumn, he saddled his horse and rode west. He carried his father's revolver at his hip. The road to Blackwater was familiar now. The town looked even more refined than before, cleaner, busier, more confident in its permanence. Jack rode through its streets without hesitation, eyes steady, posture composed. He asked quietly for Edgar Ross, and he found him near the riverbank outside town, fishing alone in the gentle afternoon light. Ross looked older, grayer, but not diminished. He turned at the sound of approaching hooves and regarded Jack with mild curiosity. "Yes?" Ross asked. Jack dismounted slowly, boots pressing into soft earth near the water's edge. He introduced himself without raising his voice. Ross's expression shifted slightly as recognition dawned. "I suppose this was inevitable," Ross said calmly. The river flowed steadily behind him, sunlight flickering across its surface. Jack did not deliver a speech. He did not recount the past. He simply drew his revolver. The duel was brief and quiet beneath open sky. 2 shots echoed across the water. Ross fell backward into the grass near the riverbank, his fishing pole slipping from his grasp into the current. The world did not pause. Birds lifted from nearby trees and resettled moments later. The river continued its steady flow toward distant horizons. Jack stood for a long time beside the fallen agent. There was no triumph in his expression, only completion. As the sun lowered toward evening and cast long shadows across the water, Jack mounted his horse once more and rode away from Blackwater without haste. Behind him, civilization continued forward, trains running on schedule, telegraph wires humming faintly in the wind. But on the open plains beyond the city, beneath a wide and fading sky, the Marston name carried forward not as outlaw, nor as martyr, but as a reminder that some debts, even in an age of order, are never truly erased. The river did not remember the sound of the gunshots for long. By the time the echoes faded across the water, the surface had already smoothed itself into quiet ripples. The fishing pole drifted slowly downstream, catching briefly on a cluster of reeds before slipping free again. Edgar Ross lay still on the grass near the bank, his coat darkening beneath him as the late afternoon light thinned into evening. Jack Marston remained where he stood for several long breaths after the final shot. He had imagined this moment before, in restless dreams, in the quiet spaces between chores at Beecher's Hope, in the silent hours after Abigail's passing, when the ranch felt too large and too empty. In those imaginings, there had been anger, heat, some sharp release of long-held grief. Instead, there was only stillness. The wind moved lightly off the river, stirring the tall grass around Ross's body. Somewhere behind him, Blackwater continued its steady hum, carriage wheels on cobblestone, distant laughter from a restaurant window, the faint ring of a shop bell opening for evening trade. Civilization did not pause to mark the fall of one of its architects. Jack holstered the revolver slowly. He did not kneel beside the body. He did not check for a pulse. The exchange had been clean and final. Ross had understood it before it happened. The recognition in his eyes had not been fear, but acceptance. The final consequence of a life built on careful decisions and quieter betrayals. The sky above the river had begun to soften into shades of amber and muted rose. Jack removed his hat briefly, not in reverence, but in acknowledgement of the weight that had just shifted. The name Marston had been hunted once. Now it had answered. He mounted his horse and rode west out of town, choosing a narrow trail that curved away from the main road. He did not hurry. There was no pursuit immediately visible, though he understood that Blackwater would eventually stir, that questions would be asked, that reports would be filed. But the riverbank had been isolated, the duel brief, the witnesses non-existent. The land opened gradually as he left the town behind. The road stretched wide and unbroken beneath a sky that seemed larger than it had that morning. The tall grass bent gently in the breeze, whispering softly against itself in slow, rhythmic motion. Jack rode without destination at first. He passed familiar fences. He crossed shallow streams. He watched telegraph poles march in straight lines across the plains, their wires humming faintly in the cooling air. The world that had cornered his father had not changed in its ambition. It continued forward, expanding, refining, organizing itself into neat boundaries. But Jack no longer felt pressed by it. As night began to settle across the countryside, he made camp beneath a low rise overlooking a distant stretch of railroad. The faint glow of a passing train illuminated the horizon briefly before fading into darkness. He sat beside a small fire, his father's revolver resting near his boot. He did not speak aloud. He did not replay the duel in his mind. Instead, he thought of the ranch, of early mornings when frost clung to fence posts, of Abigail humming softly while preparing breakfast, of John riding along the perimeter at dawn, posture steady, silhouette cut clean against rising light. The ranch still stood. The graves still marked the edge of the property. Jack had not left forever, but something in him had shifted beyond return. The boy who once read novels beneath the tree near the barn had grown into something the frontier had shaped deliberately. He understood now what his father had come to know too late, that the world rarely grants men clean exits from their past. The fire burned low. Crickets began their steady chorus. In the distance, coyotes called softly across the plains. Jack leaned back against his saddle and watched the stars gather overhead. They were the same stars his father had once watched from the porch of Beecher's Hope, the same sky that had stretched over Dutch's speeches and Arthur's final sunrise. The age of outlaws had ended, but the age of reckoning lingered quietly in its wake. By morning, Jack would ride again. Whether back toward the ranch or further into the wide and uncertain West, even he did not yet know. The future no longer arrived in orders or ultimatums. It arrived in open land and difficult choice. The night deepened slowly around him, wrapping the plains in cool darkness. And beneath that immense sky, alone but unafraid, Jack Marston rested beside a dying fire, carrying forward the last echo of a name that refused to disappear quietly. Morning arrived gently over the plains, spreading pale light across the horizon in slow, deliberate bands of gold. Jack Marston woke before the sun fully cleared the eastern ridge, the embers of his campfire glowing faintly beneath a thin layer of ash. The night air still lingered cool against his skin, and for a few quiet moments he remained seated, watching the world return to motion. A train moved in the far distance, its whistle low and hollow, a reminder that the country continued its steady transformation. Steel tracks cut across land that once belonged only to hoofbeats and open sky. Telegraph wires stretched in disciplined lines from pole to pole, humming faintly with messages that moved faster than horses ever could. Jack stood slowly and extinguished the last of the coals with careful intention. He saddled his horse without haste, his movements deliberate and steady, as though each action required quiet consideration. The previous afternoon remained vivid in his memory, not in flashes of violence, but in the stillness that followed. He did not feel chased. He did not feel triumphant. He felt altered. He rode north as the sun climbed higher, angling toward Beecher's Hope. The land rolled gently beneath him, the tall grass bending in patient waves under the warming breeze. The ranch appeared gradually over the rise, unchanged in its silhouette against the sky. The barn stood firm. The house rested in familiar proportion beside it. Smoke no longer rose from the chimney as it once had, but the structure held steady, stubborn against the passage of time. Jack slowed as he approached the gate. He dismounted and walked the final few steps on foot, his boots pressing into the earth that still held the faint outlines of old tire tracks and wagon ruts. The yard was quiet. The repairs he had made after the morning of gunfire still held. The boards had been replaced, the fence reinforced. Life had continued, even in absence. He walked first to the graves at the edge of the property. Two markers stood side by side beneath the wide sky, their wood weathered slightly by wind and rain. Grass had grown thicker around their base. Jack removed his hat and stood there without speaking, allowing the silence to settle fully around him. He did not recount the duel by the river. He did not seek approval from the earth. He simply stood as a son and as a man, recognizing that the path forward no longer involved pursuit or flight. After a long while, he returned to the house. Inside, dust had begun to gather lightly along windowsills and table edges. The rooms carried the faint scent of old wood and quiet memory. Jack moved slowly through each space, touching nothing at first, simply observing. The table where his father once set down his hat, the chair where Abigail had sewn in the evening light, the small shelf near the door where books once rested in careful stacks. He opened a window to let in the morning air. Sunlight spilled across the floorboards, warming the interior in soft layers. The ranch no longer felt like inheritance alone. It felt like responsibility. Not the kind imposed by government men or shifting revolutions, but the quieter kind that asks only that something be maintained. The rest of the day passed in steady rhythm. Jack rode the perimeter as his father once had, checking fence lines, mending a loose board along the western edge, refilling the trough beside the barn. He worked without urgency, his posture relaxed but attentive. The land responded the way it always had, not with praise, not with recognition, but with consistency. By evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in amber and violet, Jack sat on the porch steps where his father had once rested after long days of labor. The wind moved gently through the tall grass, carrying the soft rustle of movement across open fields. He considered the future without romanticizing it. The world beyond Beecher's Hope would continue its march forward. Blackwater would grow larger. Cities would expand. Laws would tighten around land that once belonged to no one. There would be men who spoke of progress and men who spoke of resistance. Jack no longer felt compelled to stand at the center of that collision. He understood now that his father's final act had not been vengeance, but delay, buying time for something simpler to exist a little longer. The sky darkened slowly above him. Stars emerged one by one across the vastness overhead, the same steady constellation that had watched over campfires and revolutions, over railroads and ranch houses alike. Jack leaned back against the porch post and allowed the quiet to fill the spaces where urgency once lived. In the distance, a coyote called across the plains. The sound carried softly, then faded. Beecher's hope rested beneath the immense and patient sky, no longer hunted, no longer commanded, simply present. And for the first time since childhood, Jack Marston felt not the pull of pursuit, but the quiet weight of choice. The freedom to remain, or to ride, not because he was forced, but because he wished to. The wind brushed gently across the fields as night deepened, and the land, indifferent yet enduring, held him there in calm silence. The first frost of the season came quietly, settling over Beecher's hope in the hours before dawn and clinging to the tall grass in a fine, silver layer. When Jack stepped out onto the porch that morning, his breath rose in pale clouds before him, and the world felt momentarily suspended between autumn and winter. The fields shimmered faintly beneath the growing light, each blade of grass edged in white, as though the land itself had been outlined carefully by an unseen hand. He stood there for some time before beginning his chores, listening to the stillness that only cold mornings seemed to carry. The barnwood creaked faintly as it adjusted to the temperature. A distant crow called once and then fell silent. Nothing else moved. Jack worked steadily through the morning, his movements deliberate and unhurried. He had come to understand that routine was not confinement, but grounding. The simple act of tending cattle, mending fence, and hauling water anchored him to something that did not shift beneath him like politics or revolutions. The land required patience and effort, but it did not betray. By midday, the frost had melted into damp earth, leaving the fields darkened and soft beneath his boots. He paused near the southern fence line and looked out across the open plains, where telegraph poles still marked the slow advance of modern order. A train passed in the far distance, its faint whistle drifting across the wind before dissolving into silence. The sound did not stir him as it once might have. It was simply part of the world now. That afternoon, a rider approached along the eastern trail. Jack noticed the dust first, then the steady outline of a single horse moving at measured pace. He did not reach for his revolver immediately. Instead, he waited near the gate, posture calm, hat tipped low against the sun. The rider proved to be a neighboring rancher, an older man whose land bordered the northern ridge. He removed his hat respectfully as he approached, offering quiet condolences that felt delayed but sincere. News traveled slowly across open country, and though no one spoke loudly of what had happened by the river in Blackwater, the understanding had settled among those who paid attention. They spoke for a while about cattle prices, about the coming winter, about rumors of expanding rail lines further west. It was ordinary conversation, and in its ordinariness there was comfort. Jack realized that the world beyond the ranch did not revolve around vengeance or lawmen. It revolved around harvests, storms, and the steady passage of seasons. When the neighbor departed, Jack returned to the graves at the edge of the property. The wooden markers stood firm, though weather had softened their edges. He knelt and brushed away fallen leaves that had gathered at the base. He did not speak aloud, but in the quiet of that moment, he felt something shift within him. Not the sharp weight of anger that had once driven him to the riverbank, but a deeper understanding of what had truly been inherited. His father had not fought to keep the outlaw life alive. He had fought to end it. The afternoon light began to fade slowly as he finished his work. A low wind rolled in from the west, bending the tall grass and stirring the bare branches near the house. Jack secured the barn door and latched the gate before stepping back onto the porch. He sat where his father once had, boots resting lightly against the wooden rail, revolver set beside him more out of habit than necessity. The sky deepened into violet and gold as the sun lowered beyond distant hills. The world felt wide and unhurried, unconcerned with the private battles that had once unfolded upon it. As darkness gathered, he found himself thinking not of Ross, nor of Dutch, nor of the final gunshot by the river. He thought instead of mornings when frost touched the fields, of evenings when his mother's voice drifted softly through open windows, of the steady rhythm of hooves along the perimeter fence. The legacy left behind was not revenge. It was endurance. A man could choose to fight the world until it swallowed him whole, or he could choose to carve out a small piece of it and hold it steady against the tide of change. John Marston had chosen the latter in the end, even when the world refused to honor it. Jack rose from the porch as night fully settled across Beecher's Hope. Stars appeared overhead in patient clusters, bright against the deepening sky. He stepped inside the house and closed the door behind him, the latch clicking softly into place. Outside, the wind moved across the plains with quiet persistence. The railroad continued its expansion somewhere beyond the horizon. Cities grew. Laws tightened. The country marched forward into a new century. But at the edge of that forward motion, beneath an immense and indifferent sky, Beecher's Hope remained. Not as a monument to outlaw legend, nor as a symbol of rebellion, but as a quiet testament to the fragile attempt at peace that had once lived there. And for now, that was enough. Winter settled over Beecher's Hope in patient layers, not with a single storm, but with a slow tightening of the air and a gradual paling of the fields. Frost lingered longer each morning, and the grass no longer bent so easily beneath the wind. Jack adjusted to the season without complaint, rising before dawn to break the thin crust of ice that formed along the trough, checking the cattle for signs of strain, stacking wood carefully against the side of the house in preparation for colder nights. The ranch no longer echoed with voices, yet it did not feel abandoned. The boards creaked in familiar ways, the barn door groaned softly when opened, and the porch steps held steady beneath his boots. Routine had deepened into something steadier than obligation. It had become choice. There were days when the sky remained low and gray, pressing gently against the horizon, as if the world had drawn its breath inward. On those afternoons, Jack would sit at the kitchen table with one of the old books he had once read beneath the tree near the barn. The words carried him into other lives and distant cities, places where men debated politics in polished halls or crossed oceans on steamships bound for continents he had never seen. He did not read to escape Beecher's Hope, but to understand the larger current that moved beyond its fences. The country was changing quickly. Newspapers that reached the nearest town spoke of expanding industry, of automobiles appearing on city streets, of new laws designed to regulate land and labor. The frontier, once spoken of as a place of opportunity, was increasingly described as settled. The language itself had shifted. Jack sometimes wondered what his father would have made of that. John had lived long enough to feel the squeeze of civilization tightening around him. long enough to understand that the old way of life was ending. Yet he had not fought to preserve it for its own sake. He had fought for a patch of land, a house, a future for his family that did not involve running. That understanding deepened with time. One afternoon, as snow began to fall in light, uncertain flurries, Jack rode the northern boundary of the ranch and paused near the ridge overlooking the plains. The land stretched outward in pale shades of white and muted gold, the telegraph poles standing like quiet sentinels in the distance. A train moved slowly across the horizon, its smoke rising in a dark plume against the overcast sky. He felt no resentment watching it. The train did not represent an enemy. It represented momentum. The world was not cruel simply because it moved forward. It was indifferent to those who could not keep pace. Jack turned his horse back toward the ranch as the snowfall thickened. By the time he reached the barn, the yard was already dusted in white. He secured the animals carefully, ensuring the doors were latched against the coming wind. That evening, he stood once more at the graves. Snow gathered lightly along the wooden markers, softening their edges and muting the carved letters. He brushed away the accumulation gently, revealing the names beneath. The air was still, and the snowfall absorbed all distant sound, leaving the world hushed. He did not speak aloud, but in that quiet he acknowledged something final. The line of violence that had followed his family for years had reached its natural end. There would always be men who sought control, always systems that tightened around those who resisted them. But the answer did not have to be gunfire. He had chosen his moment by the river, and that choice would follow him in ways he could not fully predict. Yet it did not define the totality of his future. It was one act among many, not the foundation of who he would become. The snow continued to fall as he returned to the house. Inside, the fire cast warm light across the floorboards, and the small room felt secure against the weather. Jack removed his coat and hung it near the door, then sat by the hearth with a book resting open on his knee. The crackle of burning wood filled the space between pages as he read slowly, the storm outside growing steadier. Beyond the ranch, beyond the plains and the railroad tracks, the country entered a new century with restless ambition. Machines would replace horses. Cities would stretch higher. Laws would grow more intricate and more binding. But here, at the edge of that transformation, Beecher's hope remained a place carved from persistence rather than rebellion. Jack closed the book and leaned back in his chair as the fire burned low. The storm outside had softened the world into silence, the snow layering the land in clean white that erased the scars of past gunfire and broken boards. For the first time in many years, the Marston name did not carry pursuit behind it. It carried memory. And memory, unlike vengeance, did not demand motion. The wind brushed softly against the walls of the house, but it did not penetrate them. The night held steady, protective and vast, as the ranch settled into winter's quiet embrace. Spring returned to Beecher's hope with the same quiet certainty that had carried winter across the plains. The snow receded slowly into damp earth, leaving behind dark soil and the first thin shoots of new grass pressing upward toward the light. The wind shifted in tone, no longer sharp with cold, but gentle and persistent, moving across the fields in wide, steady arcs. The land did not rush its renewal. It unfolded patiently, as it always had. Jack Marston rose early on the first morning when the frost failed to return. He stepped onto the porch and breathed in air that felt changed in subtle but undeniable ways. The barn roof caught the sun in a soft glow, and birds had begun to gather again along the fence posts, their calls punctuating the stillness. He moved through his chores with the same steady rhythm he had cultivated over the winter months. Fences were checked and straightened. Tools were repaired. A portion of the southern field was cleared in preparation for planting. Each action was deliberate and careful, not driven by urgency, but by quiet commitment. The ranch had endured through gunfire and grief. It would endure through time. By midday, he rode out along the western boundary and paused at the rise overlooking the plains. The view stretched wide and unbroken, a sea of green and gold rolling beneath the enormous sky. In the distance, a train moved along its tracks, smaller than before, as though even that symbol of modern advance had settled into the landscape rather than dominating it. Jack watched it pass without resentment or longing. He understood now that the frontier had never truly belonged to anyone. It had been shaped by ambition, by violence, by hope, and by the relentless forward motion of a country convinced of its own destiny. His father had lived at the fault line of that motion, caught between the dying age of outlaws and the rising order of institutions. The tension had consumed him. But Jack stood in a different moment. The choices before him were no longer dictated by survival or coercion. There were no agents waiting at the edge of his property, no names left to hunt. The revolver at his hip rested there by habit rather than necessity. In the afternoon, he walked once more to the graves at the edge of the ranch. The grass had begun to grow thick around the markers, framing them in new life. He knelt and set fresh wildflowers beside the wood, not as a ritual of grief, but as an acknowledgement of continuity. The wind moved softly through the tall grass around him, carrying the faint scent of river water from the south. Above, clouds drifted slowly across an open sky that felt impossibly vast. Jack stood and looked out across the property one final time before returning to the house. He paused on the porch, resting his hand briefly on the railing his father had leaned against so many evenings before. The wood felt solid beneath his palm. Inside, he gathered a small satchel and placed within it a few belongings. A worn book, a change of clothes, a folded photograph that had survived years of travel. He did not pack in haste, nor did he empty the house of its memory. Beecher's hope would remain, tended by neighbors and watched by the land itself. It did not need constant presence to endure. As the sun began its slow descent toward the western hills, Jack saddled his horse and led it toward the gate. He did not look back immediately. Instead, he stepped through the gate and mounted, allowing himself one steady breath before turning in the saddle. The ranch stood quiet and strong beneath the evening light. The barn, the fence lines, the porch, all held in warm gold against the horizon. The graves rested peacefully at the edge of the field, framed by tall grass moving gently in the wind. Jack removed his hat and held it against his chest for a long moment. He did not speak aloud. Words were no longer necessary. Then he replaced the hat, turned his horse toward the open road, and rode west. The land accepted him without ceremony. Hooves pressed into soil that had known generations before him and would know others long after. The telegraph wires hummed faintly overhead, carrying messages of a future that would continue to change and expand. But Jack did not ride in pursuit of conflict, nor in retreat from it. He rode forward because he could. Because the past had been answered, not erased, and the future now lay open rather than imposed. The sun lowered behind him, casting his shadow long across the plains as he moved steadily toward the horizon. Night would come, as it always did, and with it the steady gathering of stars that had watched over every chapter of his family's story. The age of outlaws had ended. The age of vengeance had ended. What remained was a young man riding into a wide and uncertain world, carrying memory without being chained to it, choosing his direction beneath a sky that belonged to no one. And as the light faded and the land grew quiet once more, Beecher's hope stood behind him. not as a monument to tragedy, but as a testament to endurance beneath the vast and patient sky. And so the sun lowers once more over the open plains, and the story comes gently to rest. If this journey helped you unwind tonight, I'd truly appreciate a quiet like, a subscription, or a comment sharing which story you'd like to hear next. Sleepy Gamer Stories is built one peaceful ride at a time, and I'm glad you chose to spend this one here. Rest well. Until the next adventure.